The moment Tim Scott laughed at Jasmine Crockett's law degree, the entire studio thought the debate was over. They had no idea he had just triggered the most humiliating comeback of the night. The studio lights weren't just bright, they were blinding, the kind that create a sharp white halo around every person on camera. Producers rushed around with headsets, cue cards, and last-second instructions while the audience settled into their seats, buzzing with anticipation. This wasn't just another political roundtable. This was the one people had been waiting for, the matchup that promised tension, contrast, and maybe even fireworks. On one side sat Senator Tim Scott, shoulders back, chin lifted, with a confidence that bordered on dismissive. He tapped his pen on the table, occasionally glancing at the audience as if expecting applause before the show even started. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, poised and steady, her notes laid out with meticulous precision. Unlike Tim, she didn't need to perform confidence. It radiated off her naturally, quiet, grounded, unshakable. When the moderator finally kicked off the discussion, everything seemed routine. A question about legislative oversight, another about constitutional responsibility, predictable political rhythm. Then Jasmine referenced a case, a difficult, complex legal battle from early in her career. She spoke clearly, explaining how the Constitution had shaped her argument, how the ruling impacted future cases, and why the principles still matter today. It was sharp, it was relevant, and it was enough to make Tim Scott shift in his chair. He leaned back, raised an eyebrow, and, almost as if he couldn't hold it in, let out a quick, sharp laugh. Not a big laugh, not a friendly laugh, just one sharp exhale of mockery. A laugh meant to say, "Your degree doesn't matter. Your experience doesn't impress me. Know your place." The room felt the intention instantly. Some audience members gave awkward half-laughs, the kind people give when they think they're supposed to follow someone's lead but aren't sure why. But others froze, their faces tightening in confusion. They exchanged glances, silently questioning whether they had heard him right. The air shifted. Cameras zoomed in instinctively, sensing tension. The moderator blinked twice, speechless for a moment. A producer behind the glass held up her hands as if to say, "Did that really just happen?" And then everyone looked at Jasmine, waiting, watching, expecting a reaction. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her posture didn't stiffen, her expression didn't break, her eyes didn't even flicker. Instead, she held the same calm expression she had before, a calm so deliberate, so controlled, it stunned the room more than any immediate comeback could have. It wasn't the calm of someone caught off guard. It was the calm of someone who had already decided that this moment would not define her. In that silence, something powerful happened. The audience leaned forward. The staff stopped moving. Even Tim Scott's smirk faded, just a little. Because silence, when wielded by someone strong, can be more devastating than any shouted reply. And Jasmine's silence wasn't empty. It was full of patience, full of confidence, full of an unspoken message. Laugh now. You won't be laughing long. Tim Scott shifted again, suddenly unsure of the room. He hadn't expected his laugh to fall flat. He hadn't expected the audience to pause instead of cheering. He certainly hadn't expected Jasmine to look at him with quiet, steady composure, not intimidated, not offended, just aware. Aware of what he had tried to do, aware that it hadn't worked, aware that this moment was about to turn against him. Because if Tim Scott thought that laugh gave him the upper hand, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. For a moment, Jasmine simply watched him, not with anger, not with frustration, but with something far more intimidating, understanding. There was a stillness in her eyes, the kind that said she'd seen this before, lived through it before, overcome it before. The laugh wasn't new. The belittling wasn't new. The attempt to shrink her presence wasn't new. It was an old tactic, the kind used by people who feared what a strong, well-prepared opponent might say next. Jasmine knew exactly what Tim Scott's laugh meant. It wasn't about her degree, it wasn't about her background, and it certainly wasn't about her qualifications. It was about undermining her authority, the quiet authority she carried with every word. Across the table, Tim Scott straightened his tie, as if resetting his confidence. He shuffled his notes, cleared his throat, and subtly tried to recapture control of the moment. In his mind, the conversation should have moved on. The laugh should have been a punctuation mark, a way to knock her off balance and push the audience to his side. But Jasmine wasn't moving on. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, the motion slow enough to draw every pair of eyes toward her. The studio lights glinted off the edge of her notes as she folded her hands, as calm as a surgeon preparing an incision. Then she spoke. "Senator," she began softly, so softly that the microphones got to stretch to catch her tone, "I'm glad you find my law degree amusing." The softness didn't hide the steel in her voice. It sharpened it. In the control room, a producer mouthed, "Here we go." On the panel, one guest's eyebrows rose almost to their hairline. The moderator blinked once, then twice. Jasmine continued, unwavering. "I earned it defending people who didn't have your privilege." Tim Scott froze. The audience reacted without sound. No gasps, no murmurs, just dozens of bodies leaning forward instinctively, like trees bending toward a distant storm. Crockett didn't rush. She didn't dramatize. She didn't meet mockery with mockery. She did something far more effective. She told the truth. "And while you laugh," she added, her voice smooth and deliberate, "I spent over a decade in courtrooms making sure the Constitution worked for everyday Americans, not just those with titles and connections." Something shifted in the air. This wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge. This was clarity. The kind of clarity that slices through political theater and lands with the weight of lived experience. Tim Scott's fingers tightened around his pen, his earlier confidence wavering as he struggled to find a neutral expression. The smirk was gone. The casual dismissiveness had evaporated. Because now he understood. Jasmine had not been rattled by his laugh. She had been activated by it. The moderator opened his mouth to move the discussion along, but no words came. He glanced at the producers, unsure if he should intervene or let the moment breathe. And breathe it did. The silence that followed wasn't the kind of silence found in polite conversations or awkward pauses. No, this silence had weight. It was heavy, as if every molecule in the air had paused to listen. It was sharp, cutting through the tension like a cold blade. It was uncomfortable, but not for Jasmine. Everyone knew who the silence belonged to. On the far side of the panel, one commentator slowly set down her coffee cup, eyes widening, as if witnessing a carefully measured counterstrike land with perfect accuracy. Because in that moment, the entire studio recognized what had just happened. The momentum, the tone, the energy, the power had shifted. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with composure. Jasmine Crockett's composure. Tim Scott had tried to use a laugh to shrink her presence. Instead, he amplified it. And as the camera zoomed closer, capturing every nuance of expression, one truth settled over the room like a final verdict. Jasmine wasn't done yet, not even close. Tim Scott cleared his throat, a tight, uncomfortable sound that echoed a little too loudly in the studio. His forced smile lingered, but it was obvious it was starting to crack at the edges. "Well, Congresswoman," he began, stretching the smile wider, "surely you don't expect anyone to believe—" He didn't get to finish the sentence, because Jasmine Crockett, who had been calm, collected, and impossibly steady, lifted her hand with a quiet, commanding grace that stopped him mid-word. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't confrontational, it was simply decisive, the gesture of someone who knew exactly where the moment was headed. "Actually," she said, her tone smooth as polished steel, "I expected facts to be respected." The shift in the room was instantaneous. Without raising her voice, she reached into her stack of neatly arranged documents and pulled out a thick, well-worn folder. It wasn't colorful or flashy. It didn't need to be. Everyone in the studio could feel the weight of it, metaphorical and literal, as she placed it on the desk with a soft thud. Somehow, that gentle sound hit harder than any slam could have. "And since you questioned my credibility," she continued, sliding the folder closer to herself, "let's discuss yours." Cameras instinctively zoomed tighter. The moderator leaned forward. Several audience members stopped breathing for a moment. Inside the folder were legislative transcripts marked with yellow tabs, constitutional reviews highlighted in multiple colors, committee reports with sticky notes peeking out, and quotes pulled from Tim Scott's own previous interviews. This wasn't improvisation. This was preparation. Meticulous, deliberate, strategic. Jasmine opened the folder slowly, giving the moment time to settle on the room like dust on sunlight. "You laughed at my degree," she began, turning the first page. "But here's something not worth laughing at." Her finger tapped a paragraph highlighted in bright blue. "The number of constitutional issues your proposals have raised, repeatedly, according to legal analysts from across the spectrum." That last phrase hit hard. Not just her analysts, not just her party. Experts from across the political aisle. Tim Scott shifted in his seat for the second time, then the third. "Let me be very clear," Jasmine said, her voice calm enough to sting. "You don't have to respect me." A pause. Not long, just long enough for the room to hold still. "But you absolutely should respect the law." The line fell like a gavel. The audience let out a collective murmur, not quite a gasp, but the kind of sound people make when they recognize a moment shifting right in front of them. Even those trying to stay impartial felt the tension coil tighter. Tim Scott's smile faltered. He glanced at the moderator, silently begging for a pivot, a commercial break, a lifeline. But the moderator looked just as stunned as everyone else. There would be no rescue. Jasmine flipped the page. "And if you're going to dismiss my legal training," she said, not looking up, "at least be prepared for someone who actually understands the Constitution to call out your inconsistencies." Boom, direct, precise, a surgical strike. Every word landed with the accuracy of someone who knew her material inside and out. She wasn't attacking him as a person. She was confronting the inconsistencies, the structural issues with the exact weapon he had tried to mock, her legal expertise. One of the producers behind the glass whispered, "Oh, wow," forgetting her mic was still hot. Tim Scott blinked rapidly, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the desk, the rhythm of discomfort. Jasmine wasn't done. She closed the folder with a soft click. "Respect isn't demanded," she said quietly. "It's earned. And today, Senator, the facts speak for themselves." The studio went still. The cameras held steady. Tim Scott didn't dare attempt another laugh. Because at that moment, it was clear. Jasmine didn't just bring receipts. She brought the whole filing cabinet. The moderator, sensing the tension still vibrating in the air, cleared his throat and tried to steady the conversation. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said carefully, "would you like to continue your point?" Jasmine nodded, the motion small but confident, a calm pivot from confrontation to clarity. It was the kind of transition only someone fully in control of themselves could make. And that was the moment the audience saw something shift in her.
Not anger, not irritation, strength. She leaned forward slightly, the studio lights catching the edge of her notes as she spoke. Not like someone debating an opponent, but like someone teaching a class, guiding an audience, illuminating the truth in the simplest possible terms. "Let's break this down," she said, her tone lowering into a gentler, more deliberate cadence. Immediately the room leaned in. Jasmine began explaining the constitutional issues from earlier, not with dense legal jargon, not with confusing terminology, but with clarity so sharp it could cut through steel. She spoke in a way that viewers at home could follow, teenagers scrolling through their phones could follow, and even the moderators who weren't lawyers could follow. Every sentence landed with purpose. She explained how the separation of powers worked. She explained how certain proposals needed judicial review. She explained why oversight wasn't optional, it was foundational. And with every explanation, she indirectly highlighted the gaps in Tim Scott's earlier statements. She wasn't attacking him, she didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. Jasmine's breakdown was smooth, precise, almost surgical. Where Tim Scott had tried to dismiss, she clarified. Where he had mocked, she illuminated. Where he tried to minimize, she expanded. The audience noticed. It started small, a shift in posture, a few nods in the first row, a quiet murmur of agreement when Jasmine used an analogy that made even complex legal structures feel simple. Then it spread. People glanced at one another with that look audiences get when they realize they're witnessing a moment that wasn't supposed to go this way. A moment that surprises them, changes their perspective, flips the energy. Jasmine wasn't showing off. She wasn't performing. She was demonstrating mastery. Tim Scott, who had been sitting tall earlier, began sinking slowly into his chair. Barely noticeable at first, but the camera caught everything. His smile tightened, then faded completely. His eyes flicked toward his notes, then up at Jasmine, then back down again. His jaw clenched. His pen tapped rhythmically, the rhythm of someone wishing he could rewind the last 15 minutes. Meanwhile, Jasmine never once raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her clarity became the power in the room. By the time she finished, something was unmistakably different. The tone of the entire studio, the air, the mood, the energy, had shifted like a tide changing direction. People weren't laughing with Tim Scott anymore. They weren't even looking at him. They were listening to Jasmine Crockett, respectfully, attentively, seriously. The moderator sat back, genuinely impressed. Another panelist gave the slightest nod, acknowledging the thoroughness of her explanation. The audience maintained a frozen kind of silence, not awkward, captivated. And when the camera panned across the set, catching every face in high definition, it lingered on Tim Scott just long enough to catch the truth in his expression. He realized it. He felt it. He knew it. The laugh had cost him. Not because Jasmine retaliated, not because she embarrassed him, but because she did the one thing he didn't expect. She responded with facts, with clarity, with professionalism, and with unshakable control. And that, more than anything, is what turned the crowd. As the segment drew to a close, the tension in the studio hadn't faded. It had sharpened, settled, and locked itself into the air like a final note in a song that hadn't yet resolved. The moderator, sensing both the drama and the need to keep the show on track, straightened his cards and gave a practiced television smile. "All right," he said, glancing between the two guests, "let's wrap this up with some closing thoughts. Senator Scott, you may go first." Tim Scott inhaled deeply, clearly trying to steady himself. A few moments earlier, he had laughed, dismissively, confidently, at Jasmine Crockett's law degree. Now, after everything she had laid before him, that laugh felt like a boomerang returning with full force. His closing remarks were short, too short. Measured in tone, over-controlled in delivery. He spoke about differing opinions, about policy disagreements, about respectful dialogue. But the energy was gone. This wasn't the voice of someone closing strong. This was the voice of someone trying to recover. Someone trying not to sink deeper. Someone hoping the audience might forget what had just happened. But the audience hadn't forgotten, and Jasmine surely hadn't either. When the moderator turned to her, the entire studio seemed to lean forward at once. Even the people behind the cameras, usually immune to on-set drama, were suddenly alert. "Congresswoman Crockett," the moderator asked, "your final thoughts." Jasmine didn't rush, she didn't posture, she didn't force a smile or sharpen her tone. Instead, she leaned in slightly, close enough to show focus, far enough to maintain poise. Then she looked directly into the camera, directly into millions of living rooms, directly into the moment. And with a calm that felt far more powerful than anger, she delivered the line that would explode across the internet before the show even finished airing. "You can laugh at someone's degree, but you can't laugh your way out of the truth." Silence. Then shock. Then impact. The audience reacted first, a ripple of gasps, murmurs, and widening eyes. Then the studio crew froze at their stations, some of them instinctively glancing toward the producers as if unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment breathe. Even the moderator's smile faltered, replaced by a quick, tight grin that said everything. "That one's going viral." Tim Scott didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even look up. Instead, he stared down at the desk in front of him, suddenly fascinated by the wood grain, the papers, anything that wasn't the camera or the woman who had just dismantled his earlier mockery with a single sentence. Jasmine gathered her papers, not hurriedly, not theatrically, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows they have already won. Her composure was striking. After all the tension, after all the back and forth, she was the calmest person in the room. She thanked the moderator politely, nodded once at the production team, and stood to leave. No dramatic exit, no victory lap. Just a steady, unshakable walk out of the studio. And yet, that simple walk felt like a statement of its own. Because everyone watching, inside the studio and at home, could feel it. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend her credibility. She owned the moment. She controlled the narrative. She turned an attempted insult into a masterclass. By the time she reached the hallway outside the set, one truth was undeniable. Tim Scott's laugh had been a mistake. A mistake that followed him out of the studio, onto social media, and into the headlines. And Jasmine? She had walked out stronger, smarter, completely unshaken. The debate was over, and the last line belonged to her.
And just like that, the debate was over. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell for more powerful moments like this.